Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing stories to come out of the countryside. Before we go on, please tell us in the comments where you are right now. This story will take us to a place where time seems to have stopped, and the shadows hold secrets that no one has ever been able to fully explain. This video is a made-up story that was made just for fun. There is no connection between this and real people, living or dead. Now, picture this with me. It's the year 1936. The Great Depression had terrible effects on the world, and life in rural Missouri is still moving slowly, almost sadly. People who live on the isolated farms in the Ozarks know what it means to be alone. There are miles and miles of dirt roads, hills covered in thick forests, and properties that are so far apart that it can take hours to get to a neighbor. Back then, pictures were expensive. Taking a family picture was a big deal. It marked important times and preserved faces for future generations. People put on their best clothes, styled their hair carefully, and posed in front of their homes with an almost serious look on their faces. That's how it worked. That's how people kept their memories. There is, however, one specific picture that was supposedly taken on a farm in Webster County that makes no sense at all. It looks completely normal at first glance. The structure is typical for the area, with walls that have been worn down by time and a porch that has seen better days. In front of the house, a man and a woman stand with their backs to the camera, both with neutral, almost blank expressions, which was common for photos from that time. They are frozen in time, looking straight at the camera. So far, nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would hint at the silent horror this picture would bring for decades to come. Looking at the windows of the house is where the trouble starts. And that's when things start to change. That's when the pain starts to move down your spine like something alive. There are faces in the two windows that can be seen in the picture, but the worn curtains block some of them. People who shouldn't be there. People who lived on that property, according to all available reports, don't have those faces. They are pale faces that are hard to make out, but they are definitely human. Eyes that seem to look at more than just the photographer, something that we modern viewers will never be able to understand. At first, no one saw anything strange about that photo when it was developed. The couple who paid for the painting kept it in a family album with other memories of their simple, hard-working life. It wasn't until decades later, when distant descendants started sorting through the things left behind by previous generations, that anyone finally noticed. Someone finally noticed something that had always been there but was hard to see. And from then on, questions started to appear like ghosts coming out of the fog. Who were those people who were looking out the windows? Why did their faces look so different from the people who lived on the farm? Also, why didn't the couple who posed for the picture ever say anything about other people being in the house that day? These questions still ring in our ears today, with no good answer. And that's exactly what makes this story so interesting and hard to ignore. Webster County, where this farm was said to be, is a place where strange stories are common. People have always told stories about the Ozarks, passing them down from generation to generation. These stories are about things that don't make sense or follow the rules of logic. People who lived in these remote areas had a strange relationship with the unknown. There were some things they didn't ask about and some things they didn't talk about. People knew that some doors shouldn't be opened and some questions shouldn't be asked. And maybe that's why this picture was forgotten for so long. Maybe that's why no one wanted to look into it any further when they finally saw the faces in the windows. There was something about that picture that spoke to the most basic fears of the human soul. Something that hinted at uncomfortable truths about that farm, that family, and that place that had been lost in time. But we will look into it. We will look into this story together, uncovering every layer of mystery and every piece of information we can find. There are details in this story that have never been told, secrets that have stayed hidden in the Missouri hills, and now they will finally be revealed. The farm in question was in a very remote area, even for the region, which was already pretty isolated. To get there, you had to drive along a winding dirt road that went through deep valleys and forests that seemed to block out the sun. People who lived there called it Silent Valley, which was a name that meant more than any description could. It was a place where the wind seemed to whisper strange words, where animals that came out at night made sounds that didn't belong to any known species, and where the nights were so dark that you could lose your sense of direction just a few meters from your own door. People who lived in these harsh lands knew how hard it was to survive and how much work it took to build the property at the end of the last century. The main house was 2 stories tall and had oak walls that had gotten darker over the years. There was a barn in the back that could be seen in some later pictures of the property. There was also a stone well that gave the people living there water. Everything looked completely normal, just like any other farm in that time and place. But as we would later learn, looks can be very misleading. The people who lived in that house had stories that they never told anyone else. Stories that were trapped inside those wooden walls, waiting for the right time to be found. The 1936 picture, with its strange faces in the windows, would be the first sign that something very strange had happened there. The closest neighbors lived a few kilometers away and didn't come by very often. When asked later about the family that lived on the farm, their answers were vague, evasive, and full of obvious anxiety. They remembered quiet people who came to town every now and then to buy basic things. They remembered faraway waves, whispers in low voices, and looks that seemed to hold the weight of secrets that couldn't be spoken. But no one could give any specific information. It didn't seem like anyone really knew those people. It was like the family lived in a different world that was visible but not reachable, there but always out of reach. This is what makes the picture even more disturbing. The fact that the property is so isolated and has an air of mystery around it. We can't be sure how many people lived on that farm if no one really knew them. How can we be sure that the faces we saw in the windows didn't belong to people who lived there but just wanted to stay hidden from the outside world? These are the questions that will help us with this investigation. Because the story of photography in 1936 is only the beginning, we will try to shed light on these shadows in the next parts of this story. There is a lot more to learn and see, and I promise that by the end of this journey, you'll never look at an old photo the same way again. When amateur researchers chose to look at the picture more closely, the history of photography began to take on a clearer shape. An antique collector bought a lot of things at an auction in Webster County in 1987. There was a small photo album bound in worn leather among the old furniture, rusty household items, and yellowed boxes of papers. The collector, driven by the natural curiosity of someone who spends their life trying to find out what happened to lost things, carefully flipped through the pages, looking at the faces of people who were no longer alive and scenes from a time that seemed to belong to another world. He found the picture of the farm on the 3rd page of the album. At that moment, he felt something strange, something hard to put into words, as if the picture were looking back at him. There was something wrong with that one. It didn't look like the others. He brought the picture closer to his eyes and began to pay more and more attention to each detail. The couple in front of the house looked normal, standing still in that stiff pose that was common at the time. The wooden building was like many others in the area, so it was common. But the windows, which were dark and partly covered by curtains, held something that made his heart race. People. There were people looking through the glass. People who weren't the couple in the picture. Faces that looked like they belonged to different people, with different features and expressions that were hard to put into words. Something that went from curiosity to something darker. As the collector kept looking at the picture, he felt a shiver run down his spine. He had seen thousands of old pictures in his job, but he had never seen anything like this in all those years. Over the next few days, he focused on finding out where that album came from. The auction records showed that the items belonged to a family that lived on a rural property near a small town called Seymour. The last person known to live there died decades ago, and the property was left to the mercy of time and nature. No one had taken the inheritance. No one had cared about keeping those memories alive. So, in the end, the things were sold to pay off debts and taxes that had built up over time. The collector's curiosity, which was almost an obsession, led him to visit the area. He wanted to locate the farm shown in the picture. He wanted to see the place where that picture had been taken with his own eyes. It took several hours to get to Webster County, and the roads got narrower and worse as they went along. The Ozarks landscape opened up around him in waves of green hills with old trees that looked like they held secrets from his ancestors in their twisted trunks. When he finally got close to Seymour, he started talking to the people who lived there. He showed them the picture, talked about the farm, and asked if anyone knew the people or the place in the picture. The responses he got were, to say the least, unsettling. Some people who lived there just shook their heads and said they had never seen that picture before. Others, especially the older ones, did not react the same way. Their faces turned pale, they looked away, and their answers became short and quick. The picture seemed to bring back memories they would rather have kept hidden. The only person who gave any real information was an old man who looked to be at least 90 years old. He looked at the picture for a long time, his eyes clouded with age, taking in every detail. When he finally spoke, his voice was just a hoarse whisper, full of something that sounded like old fear, a fear that had been around for decades and hadn't lost its power. He said he was familiar with that farm. He said it was at the end of a road that had been lost to the forest after years of not being used. And he said something else that made the collector feel that familiar shiver run down his spine again. The man said that no one from the area ever went to that property. He said that people had told stories about the place. People didn't want to tell these stories. Tales that were only told in the dark of night, when the wind howled through the hills and the shadows seemed to come to life. He didn't give any details or explain what these stories were about. He gave the picture back with shaking hands and asked the collector to leave, saying that the past should stay where it is and not be disturbed. Of course, the collector didn't listen to that advice. What started out as curiosity had become a need, an unbreakable urge to find out what was behind that strange picture. He spent the next few days looking for any sign of the road the old man had talked about in the countryside around Seymour. It was hard and frustrating work, with lots of dead ends and false leads, but after almost a week of looking, he finally found something. It was just a path through the plants, a line that was almost invisible where the trees weren't as thick and the ground felt a little different. It could have been anything. It might have just been how the land formed naturally. But the collector was sure, even though he couldn't explain why, that he had found what he was looking for. He followed that path through the woods, moving branches out of the way that were in his way and tripping over roots that were hidden under layers of dead leaves. The walk took almost 2 hours. When he finally came out into a clearing that seemed to be outside of time, the sun was just starting to set on the horizon. There it was, the farm from the picture, or what was left of it. Nature had taken over part of the building, with vines covering the walls and the roof falling in. The windows, those same windows that had once shown impossible faces, were now empty. The glass was long gone or broken. The porch where the couple had stood was covered in junk, and the boards were rotting and breaking under the weight of years. It was a sad sight, a silent reminder of how time never stops moving. For a few minutes, the collector stood at the edge of the clearing and just looked at the empty building. There was something about the place that made him hesitate. It was like something was telling him to be careful in a language he couldn't fully understand. The silence was complete, and it was very disturbing. There were no birds singing in the trees around. The air was still, and there were no insects buzzing. It was like nature itself stayed away from that place, as if all living things knew they should stay away. The sun had already set behind the hills by the time he finally got the courage to go up to him. The farm looked even scarier in the twilight. Shadows turned into suggestive shapes, and every gust of wind seemed like something more, something alive. The collector walked slowly toward the building, and his footsteps sounded strange in the complete silence. He carefully climbed the porch steps, testing each plank before putting his weight on it. The front door was open a little bit, and the rusty hinges groaned when he pushed it. The inside of the house looked just like what you'd expect from a place that had been empty for decades. Furniture that has a lot of dust on it. Cobwebs in every corner. The air smelled like mold and rot. But there was something else that the collector saw right away. The walls inside were covered in marks. There were deep scratches that looked like they were made by human nails. There were dozens, maybe even hundreds of them, mostly around the windows and doors. He took pictures of everything, making a record of every unsettling detail of the inside. His logical mind tried to come up with logical reasons for those marks, like animals that had lived in the building over the years, or damage caused by time and the weather. But a part of him, that basic part we all have, knew there was more. He knew that those marks told a story that couldn't be explained in any normal way. He found something on the second floor that changed everything he thought he knew about that place. There was a wooden chest in one of the rooms. The roof structure that was still standing in that area kept it safe from the elements. The collector opened it with shaky hands and shone his flashlight on what was inside. There were dozens of other photo albums inside the chest, all in great shape. Albums from different times covering decades of the history of that strange property. And in each of them there were pictures taken by different people in different years that showed the faces in the windows. The same faces and expressions were always there, watching through the dark panes of glass like eternal guards of a secret that would never die. The collector spent the whole night looking at those pictures, trying to make sense of the impossible. How could the same people show up in photos taken years apart? How could those faces stay the same while everything else changed and got older? He didn't have any answers. He only had more questions that came up with each new discovery. The collector made a choice when dawn finally came and brought light to the empty space. He would take those albums with him to keep the evidence and look for someone who could help him make sense of what he had found. He knew for sure that he had found something amazing that went against all rules of reason and logic, and he was willing to pay any price to find out the truth. The collector drove home with the albums safely packed in the trunk of his car. He couldn't stop thinking about the impossible faces he had seen in photos from decades apart while he was driving. That discovery was deeply disturbing. It went against not only logic, but also our understanding of what was possible in the world we know. He drove for hours along Missouri's winding roads, watching the Ozarks landscape slowly fade away in his rearview mirror. But he still felt like something was following him, like an invisible shadow on his back. It was already night when he got home. He took the albums to his office, which was full of old things and interesting things he had collected over the years. He turned on all the lights, made a strong cup of coffee, and started to carefully look at each picture. He wanted to make a timeline by putting the pictures in order of when they were taken so that he could better understand the pattern he had found. The work was very detailed, paying attention to even the smallest things, like the style of clothing and the way the farm's structure had changed over the years. He could tell that the oldest picture he had was from around 1902. The farmhouse looked new in it, with light-colored wooden walls, an intact roof, and a proud porch. A couple stood in front of the house, but they were different from the ones in the 1936 picture. They were older people wearing clothes from the turn of the century, and their faces were stern. And the same faces could be seen through the curtains in the windows, the same faces that would show up in all the other pictures. The collector felt a chill run through his body as he looked at the pictures next to each other. There was no way to be sure. They were the same people, the same eyes, the same strange looks. He kept analyzing, going through the decades like a time traveler. There were pictures from 1915 of the farm during a wedding celebration, with dozens of guests in the front garden. The faces in the windows were still there, watching the party with the same level of unease. There were pictures from 1923 that showed the property on what looked like a normal summer afternoon, with clothes hanging on a makeshift clothesline and chickens pecking around in the yard. The faces stayed where they were, forever watching over a place that seemed to exist in two worlds at once. The 1936 picture that started this whole thing was now part of a much bigger picture. The collector counted at least 15 different pictures with the faces in them, and they were taken over a period of more than 40 years. In some cases, they were clearer and more defined, almost like they were pressed against the glass. In some cases, they were just suggestions, shadows that could be written off as optical illusions if they didn't show up so often in the same way. He realized he needed help and couldn't figure out the mystery on his own. In the days that followed, he got in touch with a number of experts in old photography, local historians, and even some investigators whose job it is to look into strange events. People had different reactions to him. Some people said the pictures were just elaborate hoaxes, saying that it would be easy to change old pictures to make them look scary. Some people were really interested, but they didn't want to get too involved, as if they knew there was something in that story that was best left alone. He met Eleanor, a retired historian who had spent a lot of her career studying rural Missouri communities at that time. Eleanor was more than 70 years old. Her white hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her eyes sparkled with intelligence that had been sharpened by life. When the collector showed her the pictures, she acted in a way that was different from how she usually did. She didn't show any doubt or fear. Instead, her eyes filled with something that looked like recognition, as if those pictures confirmed something she had long suspected. Eleanor said that for years she had been studying the Ozarks' traditions and legends, gathering stories that had been told from one generation to the next. In her research, she had come across many mentions of certain properties in the area that were thought to be marked places, where the line between the real world and something else seemed less clear than anywhere else. She talked about what the early settlers believed, which was that some places were portals, or points of connection between different planes of existence. She said it wasn't a religious issue, but something older and more basic that was rooted in the land itself. Eleanor said that the farm in Webster County was exactly like the properties that were marked. She said that she had seen the place mentioned in old diaries, letters between people who lived in the area, and even in old county records that had been stored away and forgotten. The papers talked about strange things that happened, things that couldn't be explained, and residents who said they had scary experiences but wouldn't leave the property, as if they were stuck there by forces they didn't understand. The collector was both interested and scared by everything he heard. He wanted to ignore what Eleanor said because he thought it was just the fantasies of someone with too much imagination who had spent years surrounded by local legends and superstitions. But another part of her, the same instinctive part that had sensed danger when she entered the empty farmhouse, knew she was telling the truth. There was something in that place that couldn't be explained by logic, something that the pictures were just starting to show. Eleanor said she would help him look into it more. She could look at documents that weren't available to the public, like those kept in private collections and specialized libraries all over the state. They could put together the full history of that property, find out who had lived there over the years, and maybe, just maybe, figure out what the faces in the windows meant. For the next few months, I was obsessed with this research. Eleanor and the collector went all over Missouri, visiting city archives, talking to descendants of families who had lived there, and gathering every piece of information they could find. It was slow work that was often frustrating because it was full of dead ends and clues that didn't lead anywhere. But slowly, bit by bit, the story of the farm began to come to light from the past. They found out that the property was first built in 1878 by a man named Ezekiel, who built the house himself. Ezekiel was a loner who didn't like to socialize with his neighbors. People in the area knew him for being shy and not wanting to be around other people. He picked that spot for reasons he never told anyone, turning down offers of easier-to-reach and more fertile land in favor of that lonely clearing in the middle of the woods. People in the area thought his choice was strange, but they respected his right to live how he wanted. Ezekiel lived alone on the farm for almost 20 years. He grew a small vegetable garden and raised a few animals to eat. He didn't go to town very often, and when he did, it was only to buy things he couldn't make himself. When asked about his life on the remote property, he would answer with short, vague words and always look away, as if he was afraid of saying something that should stay secret. People who knew him said he was a troubled man who carried an invisible burden that seemed to get heavier with each passing year. Ezekiel died in 1897. It was never fully clear what happened before he died. A hunter who had gone to that remote area found his body lying on the porch of the house, as if he were sleeping. There were no signs of violence, illness, or an accident. It was as if he had made the choice to stop living, as if he had completely cut off all ties to the world. The local doctor said that Ezekiel died of natural causes, and he was buried in a nearby cemetery. His gravestone only had his name and the dates of his birth and death on it. After Ezekiel died, the property sat empty for a few years. People in the area stayed away because they heard stories about strange lights seen through the windows at night, strange sounds echoing through the forest, and a feeling of presence that surrounded anyone who got too close. A new family didn't move in until 1901. They were drawn to the low price of the land and the promise of a quiet life away from the growing cities. The first family in the collector's photos were recent immigrants who wanted to put down roots in America. They came with hope and determination, not knowing the stories that surrounded the property or the dark legacy they were about to inherit. And it was during their time there that the first pictures with faces in the windows were taken, starting a visual record of a phenomenon that would last for decades. Eleanor and the collector looked at the records that were available about this family to try to understand what it was like for them to live on the farm. There weren't many documents, but they did show something. Letters were sent to faraway relatives that talked about strange things that kept them up at night. There were records of strange purchases, like a lot of salt and herbs that were traditionally used to protect against bad influences. And there was finally a property transfer record from 1910 that showed the family had sold the farm for only a small part of its worth and left quickly without giving an address for where they were going. The pattern happened again and again over the next few decades. Families came to the property because it was cheap and beautiful, in a way that made it feel like it was in the middle of nowhere. They lived there for a few years, sometimes as long as 10 years, and then they left without warning and without giving a good reason. Some just left the farm, leaving all of their things behind. Some people sold quickly, taking any offer that would let them leave that place as soon as possible. And in each of these changes, in each of these escapes, the faces in the windows stayed the same, watching each new person with the same unsettling intensity. Eleanor and the collector started to understand that they weren't just looking into a bunch of weird pictures. They were uncovering the past of a place that seemed to have a life of its own, A property that slowly but surely changed the lives of its residents in ways that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. And the more they learned, the more they understood that the truth behind the faces in the windows was more complicated and scary than either of them had thought. The investigation was just getting started, but it had already uncovered layers of mystery that went beyond a simple problem with the photos. There was something on that farm that went beyond time and space, something that was waiting to be found. Eleanor and the collector were determined to find answers, even if those answers took them to places that are hard for people to understand. Eleanor's discovery of a set of long-lost diaries in a private collection owned by an antique dealer in Springfield changed the course of the investigation in an unexpected way. Margaret, a woman who lived on the farm from 1920 to 1928, had written the diaries. The pages that had turned yellow were full of beautiful writing, though some parts were shaky, as if the person writing was too emotional to control. Eleanor and the collector spent weeks trying to figure out what those records meant, getting into the mind of someone who had lived with the mystery they were trying to solve every day. Margaret wrote about how she felt when she got to the property, which was a mix of excitement and worry. She and her husband, Thomas, had decided to leave the cities that were starting to industrialize and move to the country to find a simpler life. The farm looked great because it had a strong structure and good soil. They weren't suspicious of the surprisingly low price. They were just grateful to have found something that fit their small budget. Everything went well in the first few months, and Margaret's diary showed how happy she was with her new life. It wasn't until the fall of that first year that the tone of the entries started to change. Margaret wrote that she always felt like someone was watching her, even when she was alone in the house. She talked about shadows that seemed to move in the corners of her vision, footsteps in empty rooms, and whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Thomas told her not to worry, because she was just a woman who was used to living in the city and was still getting used to how quiet it was in the country. But Margaret knew there was more to it than that, something that didn't make sense. One entry that stood out talked about the first time Margaret saw the faces in the windows. It was a winter afternoon, and she had gone outside to hang some clothes in the front yard. When she looked at the house, her heart almost stopped. Two pale faces with dark eyes and unreadable expressions were watching her from the second-story windows. The curtains she had sewn herself partly blocked her view of them. Margaret said that for a few seconds she couldn't move or scream. When she finally got control of her body and ran into the house, she tripped on the stairs and found that all the rooms were empty. She asked Thomas about what she had seen, but he said there was no one else on the property. He said that maybe she had seen her own reflection, which looked different because of the setting sun and the old window panes. This is what Margaret wanted to believe. She really wanted her husband to be right. But deep down, she knew it wasn't a reflection. Those faces belonged to someone or something that lived in the house with them. Over the next few months, the diaries recorded events that became more and more disturbing. Margaret wrote about nights when she woke up with the feeling that someone was standing next to her bed and watching her sleep. She also wrote about doors that opened by themselves, even though she was sure she had locked them. There was an air of anticipation in every room of the house, as if something was waiting for a moment that had not yet come. Thomas was still skeptical and thought everything was due to his wife's vivid imagination. However, he started to show signs of discomfort, sleeping less and less, becoming irritable, and pulling away from people. Margaret wrote about a night when she finally decided to face her fear in one of the longer entries. She waited until Thomas was asleep, then she took a lamp and went up to the second floor. She was determined to find out what was causing those presences that were bothering her. The rooms were empty, just like always. But when she got close to one of the windows, the same one where she had first seen the faces, she felt something that made her stop. A coldness that had nothing to do with the weather, and a presence that felt like it was pushing against her like something real. She saw it then in the dark glass of the window, which was only lit by the dim light of her lamp. They weren't reflections. They weren't fake. There were real faces pressed against the glass outside, like they were trying to get in. People who looked at her with such intensity that it felt like they could see right through her, like they knew her better than she knew herself. Margaret said that she tried to scream, but nothing came out of her mouth. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't listen. She couldn't move. She just stood there while those dark eyes looked at her through the glass. The entry ended suddenly, without saying how Margaret finally got away from that window or what she did for the rest of the night. The next pages were blank, and the emptiness spoke louder than any words could. The tone of the entries had completely changed by the time they started up again weeks later. Margaret was no longer trying to make sense of what had happened to her. She had come to terms with the fact that there was something supernatural in that house, something that people couldn't understand, something that had always been there and always would be. The last diaries talked about getting ready for the couple to leave. Thomas finally gave in after a long time of fighting it. He had gone through some very disturbing things that Margaret only hinted at, as if she was afraid to say them out loud. In 1928, they sold the property for a very low price to a buyer who didn't seem to care about its history. The night before they left, Margaret wrote her last entry. Eleanor and the collector read it and felt a chill run down their spines. While she was packing her things, she wrote that she had looked at the second-floor windows one last time. There were always faces there, but this time their faces looked different. They looked almost sad, like they were saying goodbye, as if those presences knew she was leaving and were sad about it in a way that she couldn't understand. At that moment, Margaret said, she almost felt sorry for them. She almost wished she could stay and give them the company they seemed to want so badly. But then she remembered how scared she had been all those years, and the pity turned to relief. She was getting away, finally free. Eleanor's hands shook as she closed the last diary. The light from the office lamp made her face look pale. The collector didn't say anything while they thought about what they had read. The diaries of Margaret confirmed what the pictures had already shown. There was something on that farm that couldn't be explained by nature. And that thing wasn't really hostile. It was more like an eternal presence, a mind stuck there for reasons that may never be clear. But the investigation was still going on. There was more to find out and more layers to peel back. Eleanor and the collector knew they had to go back to the farm after finding Margaret's diaries. There were questions that could only be answered there and secrets that stayed hidden behind those old walls. It wasn't easy to make the choice. Both of them were very worried about the property, as if a primal instinct was telling them to be careful. But curiosity, which had been the main reason for the whole investigation so far, was stronger than fear. They had to see it with their own eyes and feel the mood of that place that had caused so much pain over the years. The trip to Webster County took place on a gray autumn day when the leaves on the trees were already changing color, giving the Ozarks landscape a golden and red hue. Eleanor drove with her hands firmly on the wheel, even though her shoulders were clearly tense. The collector sat in the passenger seat, with Margaret's photo albums and diaries carefully packed away in a backpack at his feet. They had brought modern cameras, audio recorders, and powerful flashlights, everything they needed to record anything they saw. The collector found it harder to get to the clearing where the farm was than he remembered from his first visit. The plants had grown even more, blocking the old path with thick bushes and branches that were all tangled up. They had to park the car almost a kilometer away and then walk the rest of the way through the forest, which was hard. The silence around them was complete and very unsettling. There were no birds singing. There were no animals moving around in the trees. It was like nature itself knew they were getting close to a place where the rules didn't apply. When they finally got to the clearing, they stopped in their tracks when they saw the farm. The building had gotten even worse since the collector's last visit. The roof had only partially collapsed before, but now it had almost completely collapsed, leaving the inside of the house open to the weather. It looked like the forest was slowly taking back the place because the wooden walls were covered in a thick layer of moss and vines. But the windows, those same windows that had captured impossible faces in so many photographs, were still mostly intact. The dark glass reflected the gray light of the cloudy sky. Eleanor was the first to come up, and she walked carefully over the uneven ground covered in leaves. The collector followed her with his camera in hand, taking pictures of every detail of the empty property. The place felt just like Margaret had written in her diaries. There was a sense of anticipation and an unseen presence watching every move. There was something in the air that made it feel thicker than it should have been. And it wasn't just the humidity or the closeness of the forest. It was like breathing in history, like taking in decades of memories and experiences that had soaked into the ground. They spent the first few hours looking around the outside of the property, taking pictures of the barn's ruins, the stone well that had provided water for generations of people who lived there, and the remains of fences that had once marked off areas for farming and grazing. There were echoes of lives that had been lived there, dreams that had been dreamt, and then left behind in every corner and every broken building. The collector took pictures of everything, making a full visual record of the property as it is now, which is very different from the old pictures he found in the albums. Eleanor suggested they go inside as the sun was setting on the horizon. The building looked even more sad in the twilight, and the windows looked like black eyes that followed them wherever they went. The collector paused for a moment, remembering how uneasy he had felt the first time he went there. The scratch marks on the walls inside, and the complete silence that seemed to press against his ears. But Eleanor was already climbing the porch's rotting steps, her lantern lighting the way through the darkening sky. The outside of the house made it look like the inside was in worse shape than it really was. The floor had fallen in a few places, showing the dark basement below. The walls were wet and covered in mold. The wallpaper that used to cover the walls was now hanging in damp, rotting strips. The air smelled like mold and decay, but there was something else. Something they couldn't quite put their finger on. It smelled like something very old and basic, like the house itself was breathing out memories that had been forgotten. Eleanor walked slowly through the rooms on the ground floor, using her flashlight to light up dark corners and show things that had been hidden on her last visits. In one of the bedrooms, she found old furniture that had been left behind by people who used to live there. A rusty metal bed, a chest of drawers with open and empty drawers, and a rocking chair that still swayed gently in the breeze that came through the broken windows. These were signs of lives that had been cut short, of people who had to leave quickly and didn't have time to pack everything. The collector looked at the walls and looked for the scratch marks he had seen on his first visit. They were still there, and now that he knew what to look for, they were even easier to see. There were hundreds of marks around the windows and doors, as if someone had tried really hard to get out or keep something from getting in. He took pictures of each mark, noting its depth and pattern in an effort to figure out what they meant. Those marks were very disturbing. They were physical proof of despair that went beyond any logical explanation. Eleanor was the first to notice that things were different. She was looking at one of the windows on the ground floor when her flashlight started to flicker, and the bright light it gave off became weak and intermittent. A few seconds later, the collector saw the same thing happen with his own flashlight. The batteries, which had been checked and replaced before the trip, seemed to be losing power quickly, as if something was draining them. They looked at each other with concern, but they kept exploring, moving more quickly now. The stairs to the second floor were in bad shape. Some of the steps had completely fallen apart, and the ones that were still there creaked threateningly when anyone stepped on them. Eleanor went up first, testing each step before putting her full weight on it and holding on to the broken handrail for balance. The collector came next, his heart racing as the wood creaked under his feet. Their lanterns were already only working at a small fraction of their full power when they got to the second floor. The light they gave off was so weak that it barely cut through the darkening sky. The rooms on the second floor were in better shape than those on the ground floor because the part of the roof that was still there protected them. There was more furniture there, which showed that people had been there. A desk covered in dust, books stacked in a corner, and clothes hanging in an open wardrobe whose doors had long since fallen off, and the windows, those windows that had taken pictures of impossible faces over the years. They were there, and even though they hadn't been cared for in years, their panes were surprisingly intact. The lantern's dim light made patterns on them that seemed almost hypnotic. Eleanor walked up to one of the windows. Her breath made little clouds of vapor in the air, which had somehow gotten very cold. She looked through the glass at the clearing below, which was now almost completely covered in the dark of twilight. Then something happened. No matter how many times they tried in the weeks and months that followed, they would never be able to fully explain what happened. At first, the reflection in the glass changed slowly, almost without anyone noticing, like ripples on a calm lake. But over time, Eleanor's reflection changed into something else, a different face with different eyes. She pulled back without thinking, and a muffled scream came out of her mouth. The collector hurried to her side, but his own lantern had gone out, so they had to rely on the little bit of light that came through the windows. And then he saw faces, not just in the window Eleanor had looked at, but in every window in that room. The same people who were in the old pictures, the same dark eyes and unreadable faces that had seen generations of people live on that farm. But this time there was something different. The faces weren't still like in the pictures. They moved, their lips making silent words and their hands pressed against the glass as if they were trying to reach the two investigators. The collector could see very clearly that their movements were not hostile. There was hopelessness. There was begging. There was something that felt like it was very close to loneliness, a loneliness that went beyond time and space and lasted for decades in that forgotten place. Eleanor held the collector's hand, and her cold fingers shook against his. They stayed there, not because they were scared, but because they were feeling something more complicated, a mix of fear and compassion that neither of them had ever felt before. The faces in the windows kept moving, and the investigators couldn't hear what they were saying. Their eyes showed feelings that words could never describe. And then, just like that, everything came to a stop. The faces went away. The windows only showed the dark night that had completely fallen. The lanterns came back on, and their bright lights cut through the darkness like nothing had happened. Eleanor and the collector stood still for a few minutes, trying to make sense of what they had seen and convince themselves that it had really happened. When they finally found the strength to move, to go down that scary staircase and leave that house that seemed to have a life of its own, they both knew they had seen something that would change their lives forever. They had seen the faces in the windows. They had looked right into the eyes of the beings that had lived on the farm for more than 100 years. And they were sure, without a doubt, that those beings were not evil. They were just prisoners. Souls stuck in a place for reasons that might never be clear, wanting company, recognition, and someone who would finally see them for who they really were. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts as they walked back to the car in complete silence. The forest around them looked different now. It didn't seem as scary and almost seemed welcoming, unlike what they had seen inside the house. Eleanor was the first to speak when they finally got to the car and started their trip back. Her voice was barely audible, and it was full of an emotion the collector had never heard from her before. She said they had to figure out who those people were. They had to figure out how they had gotten stuck there. They had to figure out how to help them. Because of everything they had seen, they couldn't just give up on the investigation now. The weeks after the nighttime visit to the farm were filled with a new obsession. Eleanor and the collector dug even deeper into their investigation, which was now driven not only by curiosity but also by a sense of duty. They had looked into the eyes of those beings, seen them alone and silent, and felt they owed them some kind of answer or understanding that would bring peace to the souls trapped in the old farm's walls. The study made them look into records that had been overlooked before. Eleanor spent whole days in specialized libraries looking through collections of old documents from the early years of colonization in the Ozarks. The collector, on the other hand, focused on finding descendants of the families who had lived on the property over the years. He hoped to find oral histories, memories that had been passed down through generations, that could help solve the mystery. Eleanor made a discovery during this part of the investigation that would completely change how she thought about the case. She found a set of papers from 1879 in an old Webster County archive. This was only 1 year after Ezekiel built the farm. The papers were records of an investigation that the local government did after neighbors complained about strange behavior on the newly built property. People complained about strange lights at night, sounds echoing through the woods at odd hours, and Ezekiel not wanting anyone to come near his land. The investigation from 1879 was short and didn't come to any conclusions. The officials who went to the property said they only found one man living there, and he was living a simple life with no reason for the neighbors to be worried. People had said that Ezekiel was helpful but quiet. He answered questions politely, but didn't give any information that wasn't strictly necessary. The investigation was over with no further consequences, and the papers were put away and forgotten. Eleanor did notice something in the reports, though. One of the officers had casually mentioned that he had seen what looked like portraits hanging on the walls of the house while he was there. Ezekiel said that these were pictures of family members who stayed in the eastern part of the country. The officer thought it was strange that a man living alone on such a remote property would have so many pictures on his walls, but he didn't think it was important enough to include in the investigation. As she read that part, Eleanor felt a shiver go down her spine. Pictures on the walls. People's faces who were said to live thousands of miles away. Could the people in the windows be related to the people in the paintings? Did Ezekiel bring more than just memories with him when he moved to that lonely clearing in the Ozarks? She told the collector about the find, and he immediately started looking into Ezekiel's life before he came to Missouri. It was hard to do because there weren't many records from that time and the name was so common. But after weeks of looking, he finally found something. Records of a family with the same last name that lived in Pennsylvania in the 1860s. A family that had been through a tragedy that the records only vaguely described. This tragedy had taken the lives of several family members, and then the last survivor had gone missing. Everyone agrees that Ezekiel was that survivor. And the people in the pictures, those same people who may have been seen in the windows of the farm decades later, were members of his family who had died. People he cared about. People he had lost in ways that the records didn't fully explain. People whose memories he had apparently brought with him on a long journey to that remote clearing in Missouri. The discovery made it possible to look at things in a new way. Maybe the faces in the windows weren't evil beings or troubled spirits. Maybe they were signs of something more human and understandable. A man's love for his family that he had lost, so deep and strong that it had somehow crossed the normal lines between the living and the dead. Ezekiel may have made a sanctuary for the people he had lost, either on purpose or by accident. It was a place where their memories could live on forever, watching the world through the windows of a house built with longing and despair. Eleanor and the collector talked about this theory for a long time, comparing the evidence they had with their own experiences. This way of looking at things had a tragic beauty to it that fit with everything they had learned about the farm's history. But there were also questions that needed answers. Why did the faces keep showing up years after Ezekiel died? Why did other people who lived on the property also see these things? And why, on the night they came to the house, did the faces look so desperate to talk and be seen and understood? The collector thought that the connection might not only depend on Ezekiel. The farm, which was built with so much love and so much pain, may have become a home for those presences. The line between the world of the living and the world of memories may have become permanently blurred, letting those faces keep watching, waiting, and wanting company, even after their original creator had left. Eleanor agreed that this could happen, but she added something else to the theory. She remembered what Margaret had said in her diaries, that the faces looked almost sad when she left, as if they were sorry she was leaving. Eleanor thought that maybe these beings weren't just stuck in the house. Maybe they were looking for something or someone who could finally see them, recognize them, and understand them. Someone who could give them the peace they had been looking for more than 100 years. The idea was both comforting and scary. It was comforting because it made me think that there might be a way to help those lost souls find peace. It was unsettling because it meant that this solution would depend on someone connecting with them on a deep level, someone who wasn't afraid and could see the humanity behind those ghostly faces. Eleanor and the collector talked about what to do with their discoveries in the days that followed. There was the choice to just write everything down and move on, seeing the investigation as an interesting but mostly finished academic exercise. They could have published their findings, told the world the story, and let other people come to their own conclusions. Or there was a third option, which was riskier and more personal. To go back to the farmhouse one last time, not to look into things, but to try to talk to the people at the windows and give them the recognition they seemed to want so badly. Eleanor was the one who finally made the call. She told the collector that she couldn't just leave those souls behind because of everything they had learned and because she had seen the loneliness in their eyes. She had to give it a shot. She had to do something, even if she didn't know what it would be. The collector said yes to going with her after a moment of thought. They both knew they were going into unknown territory and that there were no guarantees of success or even safety. But they also knew they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't try. Getting ready for this last visit was not the same as getting ready for the others. They didn't bring any cameras or recorders with them. Instead, Eleanor got copies of pictures they had found in albums that showed the faces in the windows over the years. She also took a copy of the records she found about Ezekiel's family in Pennsylvania. These records listed the names and stories of the people whose faces may have been on the farm. She thought that if they were going to try to talk to those beings, they should show that they had made an effort to learn about them and understand who they were and where they came from. The collector, on the other hand, made something else. He spent hours writing a letter to the people in the windows, telling them everything he knew about their story, showing sympathy for their situation, and giving them words of respect and recognition. He wasn't sure if those presences could read or understand a letter, but he thought that writing it was important in and of itself, a way to show his intentions and commitment to those lost souls. It was a full moon night when they finally left for Webster County. The road looked different in the silver light. It didn't seem as scary as it had on their last visits. Eleanor drove in silence, her mind on what was to come. The collector held the letter and papers in his hands and felt their weight as if they were much more than just pieces of paper. They were gifts, offerings to beings who had been waiting for over 100 years to be seen. That night, the forest around the farm looked different. They heard sounds they had never heard before, like the songs of birds that only sing at night, and the sounds of small animals moving through the leaves. Nature, which had seemed so quiet and unfriendly on their last visits, was now full of life. It was like something had changed, like the earth itself knew that this night would be different from all the others. The farm was waiting for them when they came out into the clearing, bathed in moonlight. Faces were clearly visible in the windows, even from a distance. Not hidden in the shadows anymore, and not partially hidden by curtains that have seen better days. They were there, watching the two visitors arrive with looks that seemed almost hopeful. Eleanor and the collector looked at each other, took a deep breath, and started to walk toward the house. What happened next would change both of their lives in ways they couldn't have imagined. Even though the distance was only a few dozen meters, the walk to the house felt like it took forever. It felt like Eleanor and the collector were crossing an invisible line between the normal world and something much older and more mysterious with every step they took. The moonlight turned the clearing into a silver glow, making the run-down farmhouse look like something out of a dream, a building that seemed to be both in the past and the present at the same time. The faces in the windows stayed visible, watching the two visitors come closer with a level of intensity that was almost tangible. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her, not in a scary way, but in a way that made her feel anxious. People who had been waiting a long time were looking at them. The looks of those who finally saw a chance to be understood after decades of being alone and quiet. She held the papers close to her chest and thought about why she was there, the goal that had kept her going through months of investigation until that moment. The collector walked next to her with the neatly folded letter in his pocket. He also felt the strange energy coming from the building in front of him and the eyes that were watching him. He wasn't afraid, though. He was calm and sure that they were doing the right thing. They had been trying to figure out that mystery for months, and now it was time to give something back to the beings that lived in that house to show them that someone finally cared about their story. When they got to the porch, the wooden steps didn't squeak like they had before. It was as if the house itself was helping them get in by getting rid of things that had seemed impossible before. The front door was open and welcoming. Inside, moonlight streamed through the windows and holes in the roof that had partially collapsed. Eleanor was the first to come in. Her footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor, which seemed strangely more solid than she remembered. The inside of the house was different. Not physically the same broken furniture, the same signs of decay, and the same ruins they had seen before. But the mood had changed. Instead of the silent hostility they had felt on previous visits, they now felt welcome. The air was no longer heavy and oppressive. It was calm, almost peaceful. It was as if the house knew why they were there, as if the people who lived there had known what they were going to do before they even said anything. Eleanor stopped in the middle of what used to be the main room and looked around at the windows where the faces were still watching her. She took a deep breath and tried to think of the right words to start with. There was no plan for this moment. There was no set way to talk to beings that were beyond what most people could understand. She only had her honesty, her kindness, and the hope that this would be enough. In the quiet of the empty house, she started to speak. Her voice was soft but strong. She said she knew who they were because she had found their names in old records. She also said she knew where they came from and what they had lost. She talked about Ezekiel, the man who loved them so much that he built that place as a safe place for their memories. She talked about the tragedy that had torn the family apart, the years of loneliness that Ezekiel had spent in that lonely clearing, and the love that had gone beyond the normal barriers between life and something more. Eleanor saw that the people in the windows were moving as she spoke. They weren't threatening, but they were moving in response to what she said. Their faces looked more defined now, and the moonlight made their features stand out more. She could tell what each person was feeling, from surprise to what looked like gratitude, from curiosity to what looked like relief. For the first time in more than 100 years, It felt like someone was really talking to them and recognizing their existence in a way that went beyond fear or morbid curiosity. The collector came over and took the letter out of his pocket. He then started to read it out loud. His words added to Eleanor's, giving her not only facts but also feelings. He talked about the trip that had brought them there, the pictures they had found, and the diaries of Margaret's that had given them so much information about life on that farm. He said he felt sorry for them and wanted to help in some way, even though he didn't know how. And he gave them something that no one else had ever given them: recognition, acknowledgement that they were real, that their lives had value, and that their presence still meant something even after all this time. As he spoke, the mood in the house began to change. The walls themselves began to glow with a soft light, a golden glow that seemed to come from inside the building. Eleanor suddenly realized that she could see their bodies as well as their faces. There were now translucent figures moving behind the glass, human forms that had been hidden for so long. There were 5 people in total: an older man with a gray beard and kind eyes, a middle-aged woman with dark hair tied up in an elegant bun, and 3 other people, 2 young men and a woman, all of whom looked like they were related. Eleanor felt a pang in her heart as she realized it was a family. Ezekiel's family, the people he had lost, the people whose memories he had brought with him from thousands of miles away to that remote place. The figures started to move toward the windows, not to get away, but to get closer. One by one, they went through the glass as if it were made of mist, and then they came into the house where Eleanor and the collector were waiting. Their movements were not threatening. They were graceful and sad, like the end of decades of waiting. The man with the gray beard, who was older, came up to Eleanor first. His eyes, which had looked so mysterious in the pictures, now showed a clear and strong emotion. Thankfulness, a deep, silent thankfulness that didn't need words. He reached out with a clear hand, not to touch her, but to say thank you and recognize her. Eleanor's tears fell as she returned the gesture and reached out her own hand to the figure she had been waiting over 100 years to see. Their hands didn't touch, but there was a connection, a flow of energy and emotion that she could never fully explain. It was like feeling a hug without touching, hearing words without sound, or getting the whole story in one moment of silent communion. The collector had the same thing happen with the other figures, who all came up to him to give and get something that went beyond normal conversation. The woman with dark hair touched the place where he kept the letter, as if she knew how hard it had been for him to put his feelings into words. The 3 younger ones quickly surrounded him, and their presence gave him a sense of peace and acceptance that he had never felt before. After that, something amazing happened. The golden light coming from the walls got stronger and focused around the 5 clear figures. They formed a circle in the middle of the room that included both the living and the dead. And then, for the first time in the whole meeting, they talked. Not with words that could be heard, but with thoughts that came directly to Eleanor and the collector's minds. The thoughts told a story, the whole story that had been hidden for so long. They talked about a family in Pennsylvania and a tragedy that happened when an epidemic spread through the area in 1867. They talked about Ezekiel, the only one who lived, who was haunted by guilt and the pain of losing everyone he loved. They talked about how he flew west, how he looked for a place where he could be alone with his memories, and how he found that clearing that seemed to call to him in some way he couldn't explain. They also talked about something else: the quiet promise Ezekiel made to himself when he built that house. A promise to never forget and to keep the memories of his family alive, no matter what it took. His devotion was so strong and complete that he made something that went beyond the normal rules of life. He had made a place where the lines between worlds were blurred, where love could last beyond death, and where the faces of people he had lost could still be seen, looking out at the world through the windows of a house built with hope and longing. But the thoughts said that this persistence came at a price. The figures were stuck and couldn't move on or get the rest they needed. Ezekiel, in his good intentions, had unknowingly built a gilded prison for the people he loved. And when he left, when his mind finally left this world, there was no one to set them free. No one knew what kind of prison they were in. No one who could give the recognition needed to end the cycle. Up until now, until Eleanor and the collector, who had done what no one else had done in over a century, looked past fear, tried to understand instead of just running away, and shown compassion and recognition to souls that had been seen as scary curiosities by generations of terrified people. The golden light reached its highest point, wrapping the whole room in a warm, comforting glow. The 5 figures started to rise, and their shapes became even more see-through, as if they were fading into the light. But now their faces didn't show any sadness. There was calm. There was thankfulness. Something seemed very close to happiness. One by one, the figures disappeared into the light. Each time, Eleanor and the collector felt a wave of emotion wash over them. It was like seeing the end of a long journey, the end of a story that had been waiting over 100 years to be told. The older man, the last figure, started to fade away. He turned one last time to the 2 visitors. He said, "Thank you," with his lips, but they couldn't hear him. Then he was gone. The golden light slowly went away, leaving the house dark again, except for the moon that was still shining outside. Eleanor and the collector stayed in the middle of the ruined room, trying to make sense of what they had seen. No one was at the windows anymore. There was no longer a feeling of being watched all the time. The house was now just a house, an empty building with nothing special left, nothing that broke the rules of the world. They had finished what they had come to do. They had set free the souls that had been stuck there for more than 100 years. And while they were doing this, they saw something that would change how they saw the world forever. Proof that there was more to the universe than science or reason could explain, and proof that true love could last. Eleanor and the collector left the farm that night and walked back through the woods by the light of the moon. Neither of them said anything on the way to the car. They were both silently processing how big what they had seen was. The forest around me looked different now, more alive and friendly. The sounds of the night that had once scared them now sounded like a natural symphony, a reminder that life went on even after the most amazing things happened. The collector was the first to speak when they finally got to the car and started the trip back. He asked Eleanor if she thought all of this had really happened, or if it had just been a shared illusion, a collective dream brought on by the history-laden atmosphere of that place. Eleanor took a long time to think before she answered. She said it didn't matter if other people believed it or not. What mattered was that they knew what they had been through, that they had felt the gratitude of those souls, and that they had seen them set free. She went on to say that some truths don't need to be proven. Over the next few months, both tried to get back to their normal lives. The collector went back to collecting antiques, but he would never look at an old picture the same way again. Every picture that came into his hands now had a different weight, as if there were stories hidden in them just waiting to be found. Eleanor went back to her research on history, but she was looking at it in a different way. She was now interested in stories that hadn't been told, in the gaps in official records, and in the empty spaces where extraordinary human experiences might be hiding. They never went back to the farm because they didn't want to, not because they were scared. The place had done what it was supposed to do. It had been the setting for a story that had finally come to an end. The beings that had lived in that house for more than 100 years were now at peace. The house could finally give in to the nature around it and slowly return to the land from which it had come. Eleanor would still think about the faces she had seen in the windows on quiet nights. She remembered how they looked, how they felt, and the silent thanks they had given her in that last moment of freedom. She also thought about how many other stories like this were out there. How many other souls waited quietly for someone who could see them, understand them, and set them free. It was a thought that kept her up at night, but not in a scary way. It was more like a calling, a reminder that there were still mysteries in the world that needed to be explored. The collector, on the other hand, kept Margaret's photo albums and diaries in a safe place in his collection so they wouldn't get lost. They were records of lives that had experienced something out of the ordinary, testimonies of an amazing story. He would take them out of their boxes every now and then and slowly flip through them, remembering every part of the investigation that changed his life forever. The picture from 1936 that had started it all was still there, but it was different in some way. The windows that used to show strange faces were now empty, and all you could see was the dark inside the house. It was as if the picture knew its story was over, as if the faces had finally found peace, not just in real life but also in the records they had left behind. This is the story of the 1936 farm picture. It's a love story that lasted through time, a story of loneliness that lasted more than a century, and a story of freedom that could only happen when someone finally chose to look past their fear and find out what was really going on. It is a story that reminds us that not everything can be explained by logic, that the universe still holds secrets that we can't understand, and that sometimes the bravest thing to do is to face the unknown with compassion and curiosity, instead of running away from it. The Ozarks still keep their secrets. The hills are still covered in old forests that tell stories to those who know how to listen. And in that area, the remains of an abandoned farm continue to slowly rot, returning to the land that once supported a family, a dream, and something that was beyond what could be explained. The windows of that house are now empty, though, and that might be the best proof that some stories can end happily, no matter how strange or impossible they seem. Thank you so much for coming along on this journey if you've made it this far. Please leave a comment below if you like this story. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel to get more stories like this one. See you again soon.